from the Frontier Security Brief podcast. I am joined today by my guest, Brian Noland. Brian, great to have you on here. I'm super excited to talk about your experience in customs, border and protection, and the counterintelligence space. Would you mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself? Give a quick bio.
Sure. I actually enlisted out of college with a degree, so absolutely the optimal career path. I joined as a 35 Mike, which is human intel collector. I did that for approximately 4 years, including a deployment to Iraq in '08. Reclassed to 35 Lima, which is counterintel special agent. Did that for 4 years, including a deployment to Afghanistan in 2010 or 2011 rather. Got out in 2014, spent about 6 years contracting, various analytical positions for DoD and IC agencies such as DIA, NRO, DCSA, and NCTC. Went federal in 2020 with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, and then came to DHS CBP in 2023 as an intel research specialist, and then became the counterintelligence analysis branch chief up here at the Office of Intelligence within Customs and Border Protection. During that time, started teaching for Georgetown in 2019, have continued to do that, and also have done some teaching at some other universities as well. But about roughly 20 years of government service, about 16 of that in the counterintelligence space primarily, along with some occasional work in counterterrorism as well as intelligence analysis.
That's quite the career you've led. So Brian and I actually met when he was teaching at Georgetown, and I was a student there. And he helped shepherd me through the Hall of Mirrors, as we'll call it. So I'm super excited to have you on here with all the experience that you bring, and we'll go ahead and get right into it. So the first question I had to do with border protection. We often think of this in terms of immigration, but far less attention is given to kind of the intel side, and even more so, fewer people are even aware of counterintelligence operations, I would say. So what would you say most, like, the average Americans and folks are missing? We think about immigration, but there's all this other stuff going on in the intel space. So what would you say?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest changes you've seen maybe over the last 10 or so years is kind of a shift away from a lot of people, when they hear intelligence officer, they have an image in their mind, very James Bond-esque, or at least somebody operating in some kind of official government capacity whose job is intelligence collection. I think what we've really seen over the last 10 years in particular is a shift away towards what we call non-traditional collectors. These are collectors who are not formal intelligence officers, but what they are is individuals who may have a unique placement and access to certain types of sensitive information. Now, when I say sensitive, I don't necessarily mean classified. What I mean is proprietary academic information, proprietary business information, a lot more concerns with the private sector now, even more so than the government sector. I've always kind of joked that stealing classified is kind of a 2004 thing. Now you're looking at things like medical patents and proprietary technology, AI, agricultural improvements, things like that. So the landscape of the information that's trying to be collected on is much more broad. Where that plays out in the kind of the border security concern is usually when people come into the country who are formal intelligence officers, they register under what's something called FARA, which is the Foreign Agent Registration Act. There's nothing wrong with people, and anybody who works in DC knows this. There's, I think on any given day, they said the estimated numbers between 500 and 600 foreign intelligence officers running around DC at any given time, right? That's an accepted understanding of that's the environment we're in with all the embassies and all of that. These people are not registering on that. These people are coming in possibly trying to gain work at certain companies, possibly trying to gain academic employment at certain universities and things of that nature. So a lot more of the kind of the immigration concern deals with not only Obviously, illegal immigration is still a huge issue, and certainly counter narcotics is a massive focus for CBP. But we're
Mhm.
also looking for, certainly on the outgoing, people who may be trying to take proprietary technology with them, or maybe trying to smuggle biological agents into the country. Not necessarily for the purpose of biological terrorism, but maybe for the purpose of conducting research or potentially trying to leverage U.S. academic institutions to get certain things accomplished. So, um, our protection kind of focus has to shift. It can't just be federal sites, military bases. We now have to concern with protecting our academic sovereignty, our business sectors, our agricultural spheres. There's certainly a lot of a focus around that as well. And then obviously with the advent of AI, our unique development along those. Our critical supply chains, certainly semiconductors, has been a hot topic for multiple years now. So there's a variety of different topics that have come into more focus. Counterintelligence has obviously come much more into political vogue. The best thing about this particular subject is being a political football. But once again, we're certainly in the crosshairs again of focus. And I think some of that is the transition to kind of the strategic competition. And the border is no different.
Well, yeah, I mean, you already mentioned it, but people imagine to a degree this James Bondish, this traditional state versus state espionage.
Hmm.
But I mean, I remember reading a little while ago about the self-driving car technology that they were developing at Tesla, and it walked out the door in the form of a flash drive.
Hmm.
So, it might not be what everyone is. I mean, people generally think of it. It might be as simple as someone who's not registered as a foreign agent who's been working at that company, and maybe they didn't start out that way when they started at that company, but then somebody got to them, they got recruited and what have you,
Yep.
and then it's as simple as walking out with a flash drive in some cases because like the degree of awareness and protection just isn't necessarily there at the
No.
same level in places like academia, in the tech industry, ag, other forms of private sector. So
Even government agencies really have not had robust insider threat programs for more than about
yeah,
10 to 15 years at this point. Really, it was the executive orders in 2012 that mandated it across all the other agencies that we really started doing it. So now you go into like corporate insider threat programs are woefully undernumbered and many times
yeah,
undermanned. And private sector also, government kind of has the luxury of not being necessarily as beholden to return on investment at all times. I'm sure much to taxpayers' chagrin at certain points. But private industry looks at an insider threat program and goes, it's going to cost how much? And it's just for us to kind of give us the warm and fuzzy that nobody's trying to steal our stuff. Like their return on investment, it's very hard to quantify until something actually happens. So
yeah.
it's sometimes even harder to get them to want to do it because they're looking at this going, we're throwing all our money into the prospect that something might happen. And that just feels like a criminally bad thing for us to put on our bottom line to our stakeholders. So it's even tougher to kind of change those kind of mindsets about why this is so important. And it lends itself to why they are sometimes uniquely vulnerable.
Well, and I think too, I don't know if the paradigm's shifting, but when you see things like Blue Cross Blue Shield having a data breach and tons of people's information being compromised, or more recently, the hack where it basically compromised Canvas, which is used by
Hmm.
educational institutions and universities really around the world. And that wasn't a state actor. That was somebody is just ransomware basically at
Hmm.
a massive scale. And obviously they got something out of it because there was a kind of a negotiated settlement to get Canvas back up and running because within a couple of days they took it down again
Hmm.
just to prove a point. So I think it is maybe shifting a little in the fact that people are starting to see, it doesn't affect me, until it does. Um, and when
I,
certain nation states don't have the capacity that, say, the Russians or the Chinese have, where the Iranians, for instance, or the North Koreans are really more dependent on that type of cyber activity to move and shape in a way, because that's what they have at their disposal.
yeah. And The scariest thing I think about the cyber intrusions is that it can really be done by four main elements. It can be done by nation state actors. It can be done by international terrorist organizations. It can be done by criminal actors, and it can be done by just straight up mercenary groups, like literally just hacker groups that decide we're going to work for the highest bidder. If a government wants to employ us, killer. If a criminal group wants to employ us, fine. If we want to just do it ourselves for ransomware and get rich, we can do that too. I think the real turning point, to put it to one specific instance, was the Colonial Pipeline
Yeah.
hack. I think that one really drove it home to people is how little infrastructure infiltration has to happen before an entire region of the country was essentially ground to a halt. Um, I mean, other than the fact that I watch people trying to like grab gasoline with plastic bags, which is you want to destroy your faith in humanity in 30 seconds. That was a good way to do it. Um, but just watching, something as very simple as just basically shutting down one oil pipeline or shutting down one power
Yeah.
plant and the follow-on effects that tends to do, it does seem to at least have gotten people a little bit more aware of it, even if we haven't seen as much maybe movement on focusing on defending it as maybe you would like.
Well, and when you take into consideration the fact that so much of our nation's infrastructure is aging, things are shifting into how much draw we are putting on, say, a power grid or our water usage. I mean, that could be in the form of population growth or it could be in the form of a data center.
Yep.
So it's absolutely, I think that there are changes that are happening and there's more threat surface in some ways,
Mhm.
but it's not all cyber either. I mean, cyber might be kind of uh, the barrier's been lowered with things like AI making it a little bit more accessible to people with less money and less resources. They can do a lot more with using AI to augment, whether it's a virus that they AI writes or something like that, but or that somebody uses Claude or ChatGPT to do that with. But it's these things are. It's not always just that. Sometimes it is that human element, and a lot of times it's a little bit of both. I mean, there's kind of a human intelligence aspect that gets access, and then maybe it's extracted via cyber means or physical means, like the flash drive example.
I a few, maybe about a year ago, I was on the National Defense Podcast and we talked about kind of the AI, and we really talked about it also in terms of information influence operations and essentially PSYOP related type stuff too. And I kind of jokingly said at the time, I was like, at a certain point, we're probably going to have to start developing or implementing defensive AI to filter out mis and disinformation from offensive AI to actually determine what's truth. And at that point, we've really gone around the bend in terms of what we're doing as far as informational operations go. But everything from influence to infiltration to potential attacks towards infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, AI changes the game on a lot of that because it's able to do things in real time that your average potential hacker or your average cyber intrusion specialist on his best day could not necessarily do. So it's going to be changing. There's going to be changing a lot of landscapes, not only physically with the data centers, as you pointed out. It is kind of, I would almost say it's ironically helpful that we are reaching this time where there's going to be a large infrastructure shift in the nation, that if there was ever a time for people to get more serious about infrastructure security, this would be the time to do it as these things are being built and as we're starting to see, changes to infrastructure happening. So, kind of hopefully those two things coincide and we can ultimately end up with better infrastructure and more protected infrastructure too, would be kind of the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and I mean the AI piece is just this defensive use case. It's
Mm.
absolutely there, but like everything else that we're watching unfold in the space of AI, what was yesterday's solution is old news. I mean, it happens so fast and it changes so fast that these companies themselves that are trying to develop and market and sell a service using their platform are even struggling in some ways to produce. I mean, and that's not to say that AI's it's not everything, right? I mean, you have trades and plumbers and electricians that AI is not there yet, right? We're not having AI come install a water heater.
You also
Um,
you also have this really big kind of public backlash that has happened
Yeah.
against AI too. And I think that's interesting is a lot of people, and to be fair, I think a lot of companies did this to themselves because there was a lot of like kind of knee-jerk mass layoffs that are a lot of them are being rehired and things like that. So I think what people did is they overreacted to what they thought the disruption of the job market may be. And then that's kind of turned into this overall anti-AI sentiment. And as always, the answer is really something in the middle. AI is going to change certain things, and it is a tool that needs to be embraced. But the idea that it's somehow going to drastically destroy the workforce is probably very overblown. Will some jobs go away? Absolutely. Will some jobs be created? Absolutely. As everybody has said, every time a new piece of technology comes along, there's going to be some level of disruption, and there will be adaptation to it. There will probably be some growing pains as that happens, but that is part of kind of the economic cycle as it goes. In the defense and intelligence space, obviously, it's going to create an interesting situation with things like intelligence analysis. The ability to manage big data is going to be more robust than it's ever happened before, which is great. There's definitely a lot of analytical tasks that were often either unfeasible or extremely daunting that will now be, possibly routine or run of the mill, which is great. The only danger that I think I see on the horizon there is the statistics are great. The analysis can be superb, but ultimately speaking, you still need to trust guys on the ground who have seen things before. And there always needs to be that human element looking at the data and going, okay, does this pass the smell test? Does this make sense for what we're going to do? Policymakers, and this is kind of the role of any intel professional, is to go to policymakers and say, sir, this is the data, this is the analysis, this is what I think you should do. Because usually policymakers bust their, now outside of rare occasions, I know your boss and a couple others that have significant military experience and intelligence familiarity, that's great. A lot of times they do not. So you just have to kind of keep in mind that you want to present it in a way that it can be understood in a short time frame, but they can also understand what needs to be done and what decisions need to be made, not to make it for them, but to just give them the best possible path to kind of make the best decisions. But yeah, it's going to change the landscape, and I don't necessarily think it'll all be positive, but I don't think it'll all be negative either.
Well, and there's certain things that it's really good for, and certainly needing a human in the loop when it is doing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at things like that are quantifiable, repeatable. It's pretty good at that stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at logistics and kind of leading into like the next thing I wanted to ask you about was like in terms of like supply chain security,
Sure.
intellectual property theft, illicit trade, transnational criminal organizations. They all kind of intersect. And I mean, you mentioned kind of these four buckets,
Mm-hmm.
but there's almost some overlap. There's almost
Oh, there's
this
tons of overlap.
gray area that really blurs the lines. Um, and so I would ask where you think it intersects for strategic competition, between countries like the United States and China, who are really pushing really hard in this AI space.
It's so interwoven and it's so nuanced. It's almost, I don't want to say it's joined to the hip, but it's close. One of the
Yeah.
biggest things I think we're also starting to see is with the advent of quote unquote smart tech, right? Is the prevalence now of smart devices. So you have autonomous ground vehicles, you have ships, you have cranes, you have so much automation that is now an intrinsic part of all the supply chains. And that's understandable, and that's not a problem in terms of improvement of efficiency. The problem, as with everything, is the minute you strap a router onto something, you create the potential entry point for some type of malicious activity, right? I don't say that because I'm trying to be a defeatist. I'm certainly not a Luddite. I love my internet just as much as everybody else, but it's just a statement of fact. And all the cybersecurity in the world cannot stop every single type of offensive intrusion technique. If that was the case, we wouldn't have threats from hackers in the first place, and we do, so obviously not. So as you continue to automate and as you continue to integrate more and more smart tech into the supply chains, whether it's in production, transportation, logistics, or management, you now run the risk of, can somebody potentially get into your systems and manipulate it? Now, it may not necessarily be as blatant as just stealing information, but what if it's manipulation of trade manifestos? What if it's a manipulation of logistics information? What if it's just grabbing that information so that a company with that particular country can now get to that market first and undercut you by 10%, right? There's a lot of economic advantages or disadvantages that could be gained by gaining an adverse piece of information or an adverse insight into the supply chain. And then obviously with certain types of really critical supply chain items, like I said, we've talked about semiconductors, only come from a few certain places. We've had some domestic production in the States, but any kind of disruption of that causes significant economic shockwaves throughout the country and sometimes throughout the world. So it all kind of works together. You also have to acknowledge that you have countries. The United States tends to let its private sector, by and large, operate itself in terms of economic work and in terms of business activities, by and large. You have other countries that do not do this. You have other countries that will absolutely use government action to further the economic goals of their host countries. Obviously, the best example of this is China. And to ignore that fact is probably being somewhat naive. It has to recognize that it does happen. And the fact that a country that is shown to engage in economic manipulation is also one of the biggest influence and biggest partners within the World Customs Organization is an interesting kind of cross section in terms of that. So there's going to continue to be a lot of, I don't want to say resource wars, but there's certainly going to be resource competition. And as supply chains get more and more sophisticated, the potential for them to be disrupted by more and more varied means has to increase. So again, we go back to this idea that you have to get private sector to understand the threat, which is already a challenge because you can only share so much information with them. And then you have to explain to them what additional steps they may want to take to ensure that their systems are effectively siloed off so that if intrusion does happen, it's mitigated or managed, or if they're at least able to identify it so they can report it and kind of going from there. But it's certainly, as the world gets more interconnected, as global trade continues to become the dominant norm, certainly as we emerge out of a post-COVID trading, world trade environment, that those problems are not going away. And if anything, they're going to get more and more complicated as we go.
Well, and then you add on that layer where things are blended between what's state actors, or a contractor, or it's easy for you name it country to say no, that's those are private hackers.
I don't know what you're
it's
talking about. We totally didn't pay those guys. Don't mind, don't mind us.
So we end up in this blurred space, and then you end up with like transnational criminals that are further muddying the waters, and it's like, all right,
Sure.
who stole the tech, or maybe the transnational criminal organization was hired. Who knows? Not at all that far fetched. So I think it is blending more. So we have this push, right, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then kind of this growth and this peace dividend in a sense, and you see this trajectory that's like, okay, we're moving in the direction of globalization, and now you're watching the United States go, okay, now TSMC has so much control over the smallest, most advanced chips, right? It's like that's only really done there. There's not a lot of competition in that space, but you watch the United States and then now also China, both kind of going back home to hedge and say, we're going to do some domestic, even though our partnership is with TSMC, which has the potential certainly to help us have a little bit stronger push there. But China's looking to push for like domestic fabs and hedge against how much risk they would incur if something were to happen, even if it was self-inflicted, like a conflict between China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
So it's it could also just be as simple as a typhoon, like we saw years back, where it did essentially pump the brakes globally on chip manufacturing, and COVID then again later.
Yeah.
So I think people are saying, okay, globalization has its value, but where do we draw the line, and what things are part of our most vital national interests that we should
Yeah.
probably maybe protect and have some domestic capacity for. Mining is another one of those, like mineral processing, whether it's batteries,
Yeah.
everything that's going into making these chips, silicon, um, all kinds of stuff that comes out of the ground. And yes, China is more than happy to pull it out of the ground and refine it and process it. And they're also more than happy to say, okay, send us what you won't process in the United States. We'll do it for you.
Yeah.
Tack a fee on it, ship it back. But it also gives them this leverage, which we've also seen them use.
Yeah.
So
The other kind of aspect of that is, really coming out of COVID, obviously you saw the diversification of supply chains, but the other thing that also really came out is whether you argue it's a success or failure, the BRICS initiative, right?
mm,
This really the first time you saw a strategic competition peer in China sit there and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to all the countries that the U.S. has either had a bad relationship with, hasn't had a relationship at all, has a minimal relationship with, or is outright adversarial to. And we're going to pitch an economic, essentially counter to what the West has done, right? We're going to get
yeah.
Russia, we're going to get Iran, we're going to get a lot of the countries in South America with the Belt and Road Initiative. We're going to get all these countries together, and that's going to be our new kind of economic system that we're going to create so that we don't feel like we are reliant on Western trade to the degree that we are while they continue to remain reliant on us. Um, I understand that there's plenty of issues with that alliance, and it obviously has not reached any level of certainly mutual defense or anything. But,
Yeah.
one of the reasons that oil sanctions against Russia may not have been as effective as we would have liked is because India is part of BRICS, right? And India had no
Yeah.
problem buying, selling or buying Russian oil anyway. So this idea that we are the only kind of economic power that can dictate global policy is certainly not true, and we're going to have to continue to kind of look at it as a global strategic competition. Um, some places it'll need to be containment. Some places it'll need to be encouragement of better trade relationships. Some of it will be mending and repairing relationships that we've hurt in the past. But all of that's going to be the diplomatic side to this, and then obviously the IC, law enforcement, and DoD or Department of War is going to have to kind of work on the security and protection side as well.
Yeah. And I mean, with what you just said, um, we're looking at another shift in kind of conventional approaches to this, where adversaries are increasingly using this economic leverage, cyber tools, AI, and influence. I mean, the only one that's really kind of, I guess, both economic and influence are kind of the older of the two disciplines there, but they're kind of, it's shaped different. It looks different than it did 30 years ago,
Mhm.
and they're doing these things instead of, or maybe a little bit less of conventional military force. Um, so how do you think we should start maybe rethinking what national security looks like in 2030, 2035? I personally, I don't think that we're ever going to escape. It's the human nature of warfare will always be there. Conventional military
Oh
action
yeah.
and force, there will always be. But it has changed. I mean, you look at just the war in Ukraine and the disconnect that exists in the fact that it's like, well, I can fly a drone from some far off location, and it's changed kind of a mentality towards what's acceptable. I mean, there's been a lot of casualties, certainly, but maybe it's less felt when you're so disconnected that you're doing it with a drone.
There's definitely a sense that obviously proxy wars that happen far away without your country's involvement are never going to hit home quite like they would, when we would. I mean, every community knew um, young men and women who may have lost their lives in the global war on terrorism, serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that. So, I think for certainly for the U.S., that's the kind of thing that hits home much more than, the situations in Ukraine and even the situation in Iran. The UAS issue is a very hot topic, as it should be. And I think some of it is, the Iranian Shahed drones becoming more proliferated and being used in the Ukrainian conflict, being used in the Strait of Hormuz and things like that. The ability to kind of cheaply produce one-way attack vehicles that are cheap, difficult to detect, and difficult to stop. I think the next revolution you're going to see is there's going to be a lot more focus on defensive technology that's able to identify these things and essentially zap them out of the sky with some type of targeted EMP. Even now, I mean, they're creating counter UAS guns, which are hilarious. They straight up look like they came out of a Halo video game. It's insane. Um, but I do think you're going to start seeing that type of defensive tech becoming much more of a focus of research and development, because right now the offensive capability of these drones is certainly ahead of what the defensive capabilities are. And it's not just for attack, but obviously the level of battlefield control that gives in terms of surveillance, in terms of monitoring of the battlefield, has certainly been felt. It is interesting though, because I mean, Russia had this massive technological advantage in terms of the amount of drones and tanks and vehicles, and they still were not able to. It kind of says something about how difficult a land war really is to execute in the modern age. There's a lot of barriers that hurt that, and obviously there was a lot of missteps in their way technologically as well. But that being said, the potential for small level disruption tactics and small level disruptive attacks is probably higher than ever. I think my biggest fear or concern is, do the tactics of these conflicts proliferate out into transnational criminal organizations and foreign terrorist organizations, who then will start adopting them for their own ends? We haven't seen that as much yet. We've still seen foreign terrorist organizations have still tended to resort to the traditional tactics they've used in the past, lone wolf attacks, IEDs, mass shooting, things to that nature. So we haven't seen it yet, but certainly in the southern border, there's a concern about UASs. The northern border, there's a concern about UASs. With the World Cup going on, any kind of mass gatherings, the ability, and even if it's not necessarily for an attack vector, it's just for somebody wants to get, footage of the World Cup for free, or something like that. There's a lot of commercial interest in UAS as well. A lot of people enjoy drones. It's also created an interesting kind of legal battle in terms of, what is your own sovereign airspace and how that goes. So all those factors are going to continue to play. There's probably no hard and fast answers yet. It is going to be something that law enforcement agencies are going to be grappling with, as we go. But I do think the push is really going to be towards better defensive tech, or the ability to essentially, if there's a way to isolate kind of the frequencies that these types of devices use, that could then essentially put like a protective barrier across an area that would prevent it. I think that's going to be the kind of tech people are pushing for.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the drone thing is a great example of how essentially kind of governance oversight, for lack of a better word, regulation of what drones are capable of versus how they're used, and versus kind of having any teeth to protect people, whether it's free footage of the World Cup or some other event, or its nefarious purposes. I mean, we watched it happen, a couple of years ago, with all these, people were very concerned with these drone flights around, and NORAD has confirmed a significant increase in incursions around military installations.
Sure.
And even that alone is a challenge. Okay. At what point does, jurisdiction end for the local municipality or county, and then it picks up for the military base to be able to defend itself from surveillance or something along those lines? There's not a lot to go off of either in the past, where you've got a connection between local law enforcement that has been accustomed to operating alongside a military installation in their area, and say, hey, this is coming your way. At what point do you hand it off, and now it's your responsibility, and what can you do about it while protecting the public and protecting national security? So drones are a great example of that. And when all these different types of technologies are changing faster than there is a way to, come up with a framework and a plan of how you want to address it. So, I mean, I guess kind of transitioning to this relationship between kind of the everyday American community and national security. If you had to brief a governor, a business leader, or a university president in America that is not your traditional national security minded person on strategic competition, what would you tell them matters most right now?
Oh, it's just everything. No, it's there's a lot to unpack. I mean, I think it's very pertinent that very recently, I believe it was a mayor in California was arrested for essentially being a PRC national agent.
Yeah.
If that's not the ultimate indicator that obviously foreign intelligence infiltration is alive and well, they're still trying to gather information. They still, and a lot of people, again, it's not always information collection, right? Foreign intelligence has just as much of an interest in influence operations as they do in intelligence collection, maybe even more so. Because if I can convince you as a nation to become more friendly with me and to share your information openly, I don't even have to do intelligence collection. I've now
Yeah.
literally cut the problem off at the knees. So I would say is, if there was three things I would give to university leaders, state and government officials, it would be three things. It'd be one is your infrastructure is everything, right? So everything from water and power to power lines to roads to farmland, agriculture, all your critical infrastructure is a potential target. Have at least some methodology or some kind of ability to make sure it's safeguarded, make sure it's protected, or at least ways to mitigate the risks is a big one. For my academia, right? Understand that, and I understand this as well as anybody, the academic environment is a collaborative environment that wants to share its information. And that's one of the reasons why they've continued to make the advancements they have. And I'm not trying to take that away. Understand not everybody has the same good intentions you do. There is nefarious actors who will take advantage of that trust and advantage of that openness for the purpose of furthering academic espionage. So don't be naive enough to, don't look like the University of Michigan that has had how many different people now get busted for smuggling in biological materials to use in your laboratory, and you proceeded to know nothing about it. That's not correct. If you have sensitive laboratories, sensitive facilities, sensitive research you're doing, there needs to be a conversation you have with your security office about how that information and how that infrastructure is being safeguarded. That's probably the two biggest ones. And the third thing I would say is, as Americans, we don't like the concept of insider threat programs. We just don't in general, right? We tend to keep out of each other's business, but I know see something, say something has been considered cliche over the years, or a lot of people heard it, certainly post 9/11. It needs to come back, right? Insider threat is something that, if it's identified early, is monumentally less impactful than when it's allowed to kind of metastasize inside an organization. Not only does it create the potential for espionage or, God forbid, even worse, a kinetic attack, but insider threat, and I talk about this, insider threat is like cancer. It almost always inevitably sucks in other people to the point where now you have 5 or 6 people that are now involved because somebody saw something, didn't want to snitch on their buddy, and now they're almost tertiarily involved. It happens a lot. So I would say those are the big three things: is your infrastructure is everything. Make sure it's properly safeguarded. If you're in academia, you need to be aware of the unique research and potential that you have and safeguard it accordingly. And then if you are in government, insider threat programs are not meant to be a thing that HR makes you sit through on an annual basis. It needs to be an active, important, critical piece of your security posture, and it needs to be treated as such.
Yeah, and I'm super glad that you brought up those points because it really touches on why I started the podcast in the first place. So for those of you that don't know, we're pretty new, and I got into the podcast space because I saw, having worked in sensitive spaces, classified spaces, and knowing that you have to absolutely protect what needs to be in that space. However, when you meet with people and they don't understand that some of what many of us in national security would consider, common knowledge or kind of a simple understanding and awareness. I left the military and I realized that there was this huge gap in understanding and awareness. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the podcast was bring together experts like Brian. Another guest we have was Admiral Mike Studeman, who is former J2 for Indo-PACOM. He was the director for the Office of Naval Intelligence. But I wanted to bring people like you guys on the show to talk about, your experiences and what you've seen over the years, and how it translates to the everyday community leader, someone who's making decisions. Because like truly at some degree, um, even if you think it's small, those things add up. I mean, these small changes made in a rural community can make a difference when you compound it across the United States, and people are more aware, and people are taking more ownership of their own role and making sure they're resilient and secure, and reducing kind of this threat attack surface. So that was really the goal for me, was to encourage this awareness, because that's step one,
I,
to get where you're talking about.
I think my favorite kind of like small town or Midwest example of this is, I believe it was 2011, 2012 through about 2015. There were multiple incidents of PRC nationals who were found essentially in cornfields grabbing seeds, corn seeds, and a
Yeah.
variety of other seeds. They were eventually caught trying to leave. I want to say they were flying through San Francisco. Now, people would be like, well, why the hell did they care? It's like, you don't understand how much money agricultural companies put into the genetic engineering for the crop yields that we get, right? And how important that is to other nations. That might seem like a relatively benign piece of technology in terms of agricultural enhancement, but clearly they thought it was important enough to try to steal it, because ultimately reverse engineering something saves you so much more time, effort, and money than it would be to generate it on your own. So just because it seems like a relatively benign piece of technology or a benign piece of, kind of American life, doesn't mean it's not have critical value to some of our foreign intelligence adversaries. And take that to heart, is that, the threat is not just coming for the big cities or the technology centers. There is proprietary technology right there in the heartland that is just as valuable, if not more so. And unfortunately, and I take no pleasure in saying this, the days of allowing the rest of the public to be relatively naive or just not have to worry about this is kind of past. This is ultimately going to be a global strategic competition that every American will have to have at least some level of awareness and wariness of, in order for us to effectively combat it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so that's where I'm coming from, and that's where the podcast was born out of. So I'm super grateful we got to have you on.
No, no doubt. I mean, I love coming on to these. I love being able to get the word out. It's funny because, CI guys or counterintel guys, we always vacillate between people calling us paranoid and then people asking why we didn't warn them sooner. And that's normal. And we accept that, and that's what it's going to be. But I do take some comfort in the fact that people seem to be more receptive to the message than they've been in recent years, which is great. It should hopefully lead to better awareness and hopefully the ability to do this. And look, I very much long and pine for a day when we won't have to have this level of guardedness, towards foreign adversaries, but that day's not here yet. So for now, the better guarded we are, the less ramifications will happen in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brian. Looking forward to having you on again sometime in the future, and have a good one.
Absolutely. Anytime.